Louis XIV, the famous Sun King of France, had no shortage of mistresses, but none were as fascinating or as scandalous as the one known as Madame de Montespan. Madame de Montespan truly believed that she deserved to be queen to Louis XIV instead of his actual wife, the Queen Maria Theresa. She ended up outliving the queen, but when the queen died, she would hit Madame de Montespan with an insult that would shake her to her core. Madame de Montespan was born Françoise Athénée de Rochechouart de Mortemart. She was the descendant of one of France's most powerful families. Her father was a prince and her mother was a lady-in-waiting. With beginnings like this, it's no wonder that she would later think of herself as the rightful queen of France. As a young girl, while Françoise was sent away to the convent of St. Mary for her education, her older sister Gabrielle had married well and was making her way up the ladder at the French court of King Louis. Louis just so happened to take a liking to Gabrielle, and the two began an affair. Françoise herself entered the French court at the age of 20 when she was maid of honor to the king's sister-in-law, Princess Henrietta Anne. Henrietta Anne's husband, the king's brother Philippe, was known for his gay affairs. It must have been awkward for the young Françoise to be around this dysfunctional couple, which is why it was surprising that she then struck up a brief affair with Philippe himself. This was only the start of her adventures in the royal court. Being young and unmarried, it was expected that she would be married sooner rather than later. One suitor caught her eye, the Marquis de Noirmoutier. However, her father preferred someone else for her, the Marquis d'Antin. This difficult situation ended up with a duel between both marquis, despite the fact that Louis XIV had outlawed the practice. After the duel, the Marquis d'Antin was dead, and since King Louis had decreed that the survivors of any duels be executed, the Marquis de Noirmoutier fled the country. Both of Françoise's prospects for marriage were gone. It was in this odd situation that Françoise encountered the Marquis de Montespan, the younger brother of the Marquis d'Antin. They ended up becoming very close over the loss of his brother and falling in love. Only a week after the terrible duel, their families quickly drew up a marriage contract and had it signed. It is possible that there was a secret reason behind this rushing into marriage, as only 9 months later Françoise gave birth to her first child. It was from this marriage that Françoise became known as the Marquise de Montespan, otherwise known as Madame de Montespan. At first, it seemed like their union was built on a solid foundation of love, but quickly the cracks began to show. The Marquis loved spending, even though the couple didn't have a lot of money. Because of the financial strain that Madame de Montespan's husband put them in, she desperately knew that she would have to find a way to earn more money. She set her sights high, and it just so happened that Queen Maria Theresa was hiring ladies-in-waiting. This position would come with prestige, money, and housing. Madame de Montespan cleverly used her connection with the king's brother to secure herself the job as the queen's lady-in-waiting. However, despite this new success, from her position in the court now, she encountered her old friend, Louise de la Vallière, who is the king's chief mistress. When she saw just how lavishly her friend was living, it is likely that she was filled with envy. She now set her sights on the king and becoming his lover, but she was patient. She remained in the distance, going about her duties and all the time waiting to make her next cunning move. Soon enough, Louis's wife, the queen, became pregnant. Oddly enough, his mistress, Louise, became pregnant at the same time as well. Now the king found himself a little lonely, and who was there to entertain him but Madame de Montespan herself? She now had the perfect moment that she had been waiting for so long. The king was lonely and wanted her, and all she needed to do was give in to his advances. However, she was suddenly overwhelmed by the serious situation she was getting herself into. She went and begged her husband to take her to the country estate, but being rather disinterested, he declined. Very soon, King Louis went off to participate in some battles. As was his custom, he took the most spirited court ladies along with him for the journey. It just so happened that Madame de Montespan was invited on one such journey. It was during this trip that they finally became lovers. They kept it a secret, hiding their affair from the queen, and ironically from the chief mistress as well. Eventually, the queen received an anonymous letter exposing the affair between the king and her lady-in-waiting, Madame de Montespan. De Montespan denied the claims. Somehow it worked, and the queen even said that she wouldn't let anyone turn herself against such loyal women. And so the affair continued. De Montespan and Louis were certainly passionate, but there was a dark side to this as well. Louis expected that his women have boundless energy both in and out of the bedroom, and never wanted to hear a complaint from them. When they were pregnant, he didn't want to hear any complaints about the physical pain and expected them to bounce back to regular life soon after giving birth. Luckily for now, de Montespan was young and up to the challenge of matching the king's vigor. There was much food, dancing, balls, races, and he lavished her with gifts. Despite all this, Louise de la Vallière still remained the official chief mistress. Even though the king hadn't yet given de Montespan a title, he showed his devotion to her by giving her an apartment in Versailles with 20 rooms. In comparison, his own wife, Queen Maria Theresa, only had 11. One would think that all this attention would attract the suspicions of de Montespan's husband, but he was away participating in battles near the Spanish border. To make sure he stayed there, the king ensured he received lavish praise for his efforts. In 1668, the king and de Montespan's affair bore new fruit when she discovered she was pregnant. Louis helped her have a secret birth, but things were starting to come to the surface and were becoming harder to hide. Eventually, her parents found out about the affair. Surprisingly, they were okay with it, as they knew being so close to the King of France was an esteemed position. However, when her husband returned to Paris, his reaction to finally finding out about the affair was quite different. He was furious. He went about telling everyone that he could that the king was a scoundrel. Since everyone knew that the king always had many mistresses, no one seemed to care. Because of this, the Marquis took it up a notch. He started frequenting brothels in an effort to get syphilis, which he intended to pass to his wife and the king himself. This was a step too far. The king banished the Marquis to his country estate. Unfortunately, he took their 3-year-old son along with him. Madame de Montespan wouldn't see her own son for another 9 years. Being the unofficial mistress of the king meant that she would inevitably become pregnant. De Montespan ended up having a total of 7 children with Louis XIV. Because of her complicated marital situation, she had the children sent away and entrusted to an old friend named Madame Scarron, who raised them. De Montespan and Louis would visit the children whenever they could. In 1673, the king decided to show his dedication to de Montespan by legitimizing their children. And in 1674, de Montespan was able to separate from her husband, the Marquis. Additionally, Louise de la Vallière finally decided to leave the court. Now, Madame de Montespan was one step closer to her goal of becoming chief mistress. Freed from the unpleasant situation with her husband and the awkward presence of Louise de la Vallière, de Montespan was exactly where she wanted to be. The next years were full of unbridled joy for de Montespan and the king. Eventually, the king decided to make de Montespan his chief mistress. This appointment greatly inflated her ego. To honor her, he offered to build her a pavilion. Instead, she demanded an entire chateau. It would end up costing 2 million livres, which, in today's money, is about 36 million US dollars. Furthermore, she started to expect prestigious appointments for all her family members, and when she didn't get her way, she would often throw tantrums. As Madame de Montespan's power and prestige grew, so did the staff working under her. She deliberately brought on ladies who she viewed as less beautiful than herself in order to keep the king's attention away from them. To de Montespan's dismay, the king started to value Madame Scarron, the devout and kind woman who took care of all the illegitimate children that they had produced. In many ways, she was the polar opposite to de Montespan. She was calm, pious, and smart. To show his appreciation for her, the king bestowed upon her the title of the Marquise de Maintenon. De Montespan obviously did not like this, and occasionally tensions would flare between them, but for the most part, they kept things civil. However, beneath the surface, there were issues brewing. Madame de Maintenon believed that their affair was sinful, and she wanted to save the king's soul. Little did de Montespan know, but de Maintenon had brought a bishop into court to help her. During Easter of 1675, Madame de Montespan went to confession, only to be refused by the priest. The priest had deemed her too scandalous. She immediately went to the king for help, who, in turn, went to speak with the bishop that Madame de Maintenon had brought on. He castigated him for his affair. Surprisingly, after hearing the bishop's harsh words, the king agreed to break off his affair with de Montespan. When she heard about this, she immediately panicked and locked herself in her room for 2 days straight. De Montespan decided to take a temporary leave from the court and from her position as chief mistress in the hope that her absence would have the king come begging for her. Apparently, the plan worked. It was an entire year before they saw each other again. During a ball held by the queen, as soon as the king saw de Montespan, he ran across the floor to greet her. Despite this display of affection, the king was still keen on being pious and faithful to his wife. De Montespan had to try harder. So what did she do? She wept in front of him. Her plan succeeded gloriously, and the king fell for her again. The next few years were as happy for the king and de Montespan as they had been previously. They spent their time indulging in food, wine, and much more together. But not everyone was as happy about this. Queen Maria Theresa was upset that her husband was being unfaithful again, and Madame de Maintenon was not pleased with the bishop for fumbling her plans. After some years of this, de Montespan began to find it hard to keep up with the king's lifestyle. Even though she was his main mistress, the king's appetite for infidelity was large, and he would frequently have smaller side affairs with other women at the same time as he was carrying on with de Montespan. Much to her chagrin, there was little she could do about these little dalliances. De Montespan's main concern was keeping Madame de Maintenon away from the king. So when one day a new beautiful young woman appeared at the court named Marie Angelique de Scoraille, she paid her little attention. This was a big mistake, as soon Marie Angelique and the king became entwined in a blossoming affair. When de Montespan found out, she threw tantrums and yelled at the king. This was an even bigger mistake, as the king had no patience for this, and it drove a wedge between them. After many pregnancies, Madame de Montespan was no longer the energetic young lady that Louis had fallen for. Despite Madame de Montespan being the king's official mistress, it was Marie Angelique who ruled his bedroom. Furthermore, the king was becoming closer to the pious Madame de Maintenon, who is now one of his dear friends. Eventually, the king got tired of Marie Angelique. A difficult pregnancy made her fall ill. As well, rumors began to spread that someone was trying to poison her. At first, it seemed preposterous until she actually died. This sparked much gossip into the idea that someone may have poisoned her. People began to accuse one another, and who would seem like the prime suspect? The chief mistress herself. This was the beginning of the famous Affaire des Poisons. It wasn't just Madame de Montespan who was implicated, but many other important members of the king's court. This was a humiliation for the king, and it imperiled his power and legacy. An accusation came out that the most notorious poison dealer in Paris had a connection to de Montespan. Allegedly, de Montespan had plotted with her to get rid of her old rival, Louise de la Vallière. It was also said that the poison dealer plotted to use de Montespan's proximity to the king to poison him as well. Further witnesses even claimed that de Montespan had used black magic and dark rituals to keep the king's love. These accusations were very far-fetched. However, the worst accusation was that de Montespan had poisoned Marie Angelique. Whether or not these accusations were true, Madame de Montespan was lucky, as the notorious poison dealer from Paris, when questioned, denied ever having worked with Madame de Montespan. De Montespan was off the hook, but the damage was already done. Although the accusations had not been proven, her reputation had been tarnished. The sheer amount of people close to the king who had been implicated in the affair was shocking, and dozens were tried, convicted, and executed. Even after all this, she still stayed on as the king's official mistress, but in title only. The king didn't want to sack her, as it might imply that she was guilty, so he let her stay, but only visited her occasionally and without any of the love and passion that they once had. In 1680, the Queen Maria Theresa died, but before she died, she left Madame de Montespan the worst insult. She left a special ring to Madame de Maintenon to thank her for resisting the king's advances and for getting in between the king and his chief mistress. Madame de Montespan was shocked, but what she did not know was that after this, the king would begin a relationship with Madame de Maintenon herself. De Montespan watched powerlessly as the pious de Maintenon transformed the king from a decadent indulger into a devout and modest king. This new conservative Louis banned many things from his court, including cleavage and even bare arms. It was over for de Montespan. She had finally lost. However, she still stayed in the royal court for another 10 years, albeit without any of the power or influence that she formerly had. The king eventually asked her to leave. She packed her bags and went to live in the chateau that Louis had built for her all those years before. After some time, and ironically enough, she would even leave the chateau and move to a convent. As she grew older, her health declined. She died in the year 1707. King Louis's reaction was restrained, and he didn't even attend her funeral. It seemed he viewed her as something from his past that he had already moved on from many years ago. Interestingly, her former rival, Madame de Maintenon, wept at the news of her passing. Madame de Montespan was the most famous mistress of King Louis XIV. Her life was filled with drama, excitement, passion, as well as scandals, gossip, and rivalry. It is possible that in her later years she may have felt remorse, as in contrast to her more sinful younger years, she lived in a convent and even devoted much time to charity work. I hope you enjoyed this video about King Louis XIV's most famous mistress, Madame de Montespan. And if you did, please like and subscribe.